Hey everyone, tonight we're going to talk about the Vestal Virgins of Rome, which was one of the strangest, strictest, and most interesting sisterhoods in the ancient world. Before you get too comfortable, please take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Please tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you in the comments. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from all over the world. Now, turn down the lights and maybe turn on a fan for that soft background noise, and let's take it easy as we go on this journey together tonight. Before we talk about the vows, punishments, and shocking lack of benefits at work, we need to know what the Vestal Virgins were. In ancient Rome, where people solved problems by sacrificing goats, talking to birds, or stabbing Caesar, the Vestals were the city's emotional support priests. Rome was calm if they were calm. If they made a mistake, everyone freaked out right away, as if Jupiter himself had made a complaint. This wasn't just a religious order. The most elite school in Rome was run by a powerful mix of fear, superstition, and patriarchy. The Vestals didn't get the job because they wanted it. Rome thought that 6 little girls could hold the empire together better than the Senate ever could, so they were chosen. And to be honest, history shows that they were right. The Vestals lived in a beautiful marble villa called the House of the Vestals, which was next to the Forum in Rome. Think of a fancy estate where you could always be punished by God. It had fountains, private gardens, and beautiful columns. It was like a wellness retreat from the ancient world, but instead of yoga, you had to keep an eternal flame burning that could never go out unless you wanted to be publicly blamed for every bad harvest within 50 miles. Their job was just a symbol. Their presence meant something. Their cleanliness was a sign. Everything about them said, "Look at us. The gods still like Rome." They were. Walking billboards for God's approval. Half of the city thought that if a Vestal tripped in public, it was a sign from the heavens, and the other half blamed the nearest politician. You would think that the safety of an empire wouldn't depend on a teenage girl being able to walk in sandals. And yet, here we are. Even though they were under a lot of stress, Vestals had rights that no other Roman woman had. They could own land. They sat in the front row at events. They didn't need a man to give them permission to live, which in Rome almost turned them into superheroes. If you touch a Vestal on your way to the execution, you will be free right away. A completely crazy power move. But under the marble, the gowns, and the divine PR, these girls were symbols of both Rome's worship and fear. When things went well, people looked up to them, but when things went wrong, they were blamed. In short, they were like customer service reps in the ancient world. So keep this in mind before we talk about their rules, duties, and disasters. The Vestal Virgins were more than just Rome's priestesses. They were Rome's way of dealing with stress. And Rome was always under a lot of stress. Girls didn't choose to become Vestal Virgins. It wasn't a calling, a vocation, or a strong desire to become a gladiator influencer or a professional grape stomper. No, it was a kidnapping by the government that was disguised as a religious ceremony. Rome called it captio, which means the seizure. This is probably the most honest name the Romans ever came up with. Think about what it would be like to be a 6-year-old girl in a nice patrician family playing with wax dolls. It was a very shallow selection process when the Pontifex Maximus, the head priest of Rome, suddenly showed up at your door with a group of men and said, "Congratulations, the gods want your daughter. No returns, no exchanges." The girl had to come from a wealthy family. Rome loved judging kids who were physically perfect, mentally sharp enough to follow orders, and quiet enough not to start a rebellion. If she stuttered, limped, or had a single, she was out because of a freckle that looked like a bad sign. If she looked calm, quiet, and very easy to kidnap, it was a win. When a girl was chosen, her father couldn't negotiate, haggle, or make it look like he lost her behind the market stalls. The state just took her. Rome loved to call it an honor, but let's be honest. Congratulations. Your daughter will now serve the gods for 30 years, and if she makes a mistake, she could be buried alive. This is not the kind of news that parents hang on the wall. It was a show when the time came to choose. The Pontifex Maximus touched the girl and said, "Te amata capio, I seize you, beloved." It's both sweet and scary, like getting a cupcake with a spider in it. After that, the procession began. The child was walked through the forum, past crowds who were pretending to be angry instead of happy that their daughter wasn't chosen. People whispered prayers and thanked all the gods they could think of that their own kids had avoided the divine draft. The girl went into the temple of Vesta, where they would get their ritual haircut. They cut off her hair, which represented her old life, and buried it next to the remains of her social freedom. After that, she was not a normal child anymore. The gods, the state, and a long list of scary expectations all owned her. This was the highest honor in Rome. The kids probably called it something else. They could only think about it quietly because they weren't allowed to speak out. It was easy to move on to the next step once a girl was officially taken into service. She left her family for good. No visits on the weekends, no holidays, and no "Mom, can you pick me up" messages. The Vests were the most important workers in Rome, and Rome thought that sacred workers did their best work when they were completely cut off from any support system. As soon as a girl stepped inside the Temple of Vesta, her old self disappeared faster than a senator's moral integrity. She was now a daughter of the state, which sounds nice until you remember that Rome's parenting style was full of yelling, superstition, and punishment in public. The ceremony itself was very dramatic. She walked next to the Pontifex Maximus with priests, musicians, and enough incense to smoke out half the forum all around her. People came together, not because they cared, but because ancient Rome treated every event like a game. Oh, look, they picked little Julia. That's great for her, and thank the gods that it's not my kid. The first thing to do once they got inside was to get a haircut. They cut off her long hair from when she was a child and buried it, like a hero who has died. This was a dramatic way for her to cut ties with the mortal world, but it fit in perfectly with Rome, a city that loved symbols almost as much as it loved public executions. The white veil, the simple clothes, and the new name were all signs that she had entered a holy life. Rome basically gave her a new name, like when a company launches a new product, new and better, now with 100% more purity. The girl was then taken to the house of the Vestals, a huge, fancy building that looked like a palace but worked like a heavenly boarding school. It had beautiful bedrooms, kitchens, gardens, and fountains. Everything but freedom. Think of Hogwarts. But everyone is stuck in detention for life. And while it protected its virgins with great care, the house also kept them inside. Guards were on patrol. People kept an eye on the doors. You could walk around the gardens, the hallways, and the courtyard, but not the city that was only 5 feet away. The message was clear. You have everything you need except for your old life. But for a lot of families, this was still thought of as a victory. Their daughter was now untouchable, holy, and living a better than most rich people. At dinner parties, parents would talk about it. Yes, our daughter is now a Vestal, not a big deal. She was only carrying the whole empire's fate on her tiny shoulders. Leaving home was like getting a promotion and a life sentence. The Romans were very good at making things like that. It was time to move our new holy child into her new life, now that she had been ceremonially cut off from her old one. The house of the Vestals, their new home. And I have to say, this place was beautiful. Marble floors, arched columns, and sculpted fountains that bubble like a spa. Gardens with flowers, beautiful statues, and rooms big enough for your own anxiety to echo. It looked like paradise on paper. In real life, it was a 5-star gilded cage run by priests who thought that smiling too much could make a goddess angry. The house was in the perfect spot for maximum symbolism because it was right next to the Roman Forum. The Vestals kept an eye on the heart. Rome watched them all the time, and they watched Rome. Think about living in a penthouse in Times Square, but your lease says you have to stay there or face punishment from God. The inside was huge. 3 stories of living spaces, cooking areas, storage rooms, ceremonial areas, and hallways that seemed to be made for dramatic pacing. The central courtyard had a lovely pool and garden where people could walk around and think about how heavy it was to carry Rome's fate at age 8. But even luxury loses its appeal when you can't leave. There weren't any guards at the doors, but the unspoken threat of breaking sacred rules was enough to keep everyone in line. The Vests were free to move around inside, but they couldn't leave the complex without permission. Not recommended unless you liked getting beatings that were given with the same enthusiasm that only ancient Romans could muster. Still, the average Roman woman had the same legal rights as a decorative vase. Vestal women lived like rich people. They had servants to help them, ate the best food, and wore nice clothes. Their rooms were clean, bright, and thank God, free of rats. A luxury that Rome didn't often offer. On the other hand, you had to deal with constant surveillance, high expectations, and the knowledge that one mistake could cause mass panic, a mandatory purification ceremony, and several senators yelling about portents again. Every sound, every movement, and every sigh at night echoed through a building that was more than just a house. It was a sign, a political tool, a religious monument, and a place where childhood dreams went to be used like olives crushed for oil. The Vests would spend decades in this marble palace learning how to walk, talk, breathe, and live with the same level of calm that statues have. House of comfort. Yes, a free house. No way. The House of the Vestals was the most beautiful reminder in the ancient world that freedom and comfort are not the same thing. Once a young Vestal got used to her, it was time for her main job in the marble-scented prison of luxury. Rome took the job more seriously than elections, omens, or the safety of their bridges, keeping the flame of love alive. This flame was different. It wasn't a pretty torch or a warm fire in the fireplace. This was Vesta's holy fire, which was like the spiritual Wi-Fi of ancient Rome. Rome did well as long as it stayed lit. Rome thought that if it went out, chaos would start right away. Politicians, crops failing, and armies losing, making choices that are even worse than usual. Rome blamed the gods for everything when they didn't want to blame themselves. For the Vestals, this meant one easy rule: never let the fire go out. They took care of it day and night in shifts, like little divine firefighters who were also supposed to be clean, quiet, and calm. Think about the stress. You are 8 years old. Your sandals are too big for you. You miss home, and you have to stop the Roman Empire from falling. At the same time, the average adult Roman man couldn't even keep his toga from falling off. Every day, the vessels gathered firewood, cleaned the hearth, and made ritual offerings to keep the fire going. They used holy tools, holy procedures, and probably holy patience, since they weren't even allowed to roll their eyes. With respect and grace, the whole thing had to be done. Don't rush, don't complain, and don't blow out the flame on purpose. And if the fire went out, it would have been a disaster. Of heavenly size, the Vestal in charge would be whipped lightly for religious reasons. The priests said that even though we all know that Rome and gentle rarely went together, the city would do emergency purification rituals, kill animals, chant prayers, and loudly wonder which god they had offended this time. But here's the catch. It wasn't always the ship's fault that the fire went out. There were times when storms came through. The wind would sometimes catch the smoke wrong. The gods were sometimes just being dramatic. But Rome never blamed the gods. Oh no. Rome blamed the teenage girl who had a broom and a job description that was longer than most senators' resumes. Even though the stakes were very high, the Vestals kept that flame alive for more than 1,000 years through wars, plagues, coups, and whatever strange things Caligula was up to that day. The flame stayed alive because 6 scared priestesses were very, very motivated not to let down a goddess who had a history of getting angry and burning things. People didn't trust a Vestal Virgin to be anywhere near. She had to survive 10 years of training to become the sacred flame. A 10-year crash course in how to be perfect in public, how to be precise in rituals, and how to not accidentally offend a goddess who could destroy whole cities if she didn't get her grain offerings. These first 10 years were like boot camp for priestesses. Instead of push ups and obstacle courses, the girls learned how to fold their robes correctly, memorize hundreds of ritual instructions, and stand still for long periods of time without scratching their noses. This might sound easy, but think about Roman religion. There was meaning in everything. Everything had a purpose. And if you took 2 steps to the left, everything could go horribly wrong. The curriculum included learning sacred chants by heart and not getting any of the words wrong, learning how to do purification rituals that used water, fire, smoke, grain, or sometimes all of them at once. Knowing what omens mean because no one wants to get the wrong idea when a crow lands on the wrong side of a statue. Keeping the sacred tools like knives, brooms, ladles, and other things that the gods supposedly needed. How to keep a straight face when a senator starts talking about comets again. They also had to learn how to read and write. A big deal because Roman girls usually didn't go to school. The Vestals were studying law, ritual text, and the kinds of philosophical questions that only come up when someone makes you sit quietly next to a holy fire for hours. Meanwhile, other girls were getting married or working with spindles. Fire. But they weren't alone. Senior Vestals were teachers, mentors, and role models who scared you a little bit. Picture a strict nun who also works as a political consultant and has been keeping a flame alive for 27 years on just 4 hours of sleep. These women were serious about their jobs because they knew what was at stake. The pride of Rome, the anger of Vesta, and the chance that they would be held responsible for disasters that were completely out of their control. Training was very strict. Mistakes were fixed right away. And if a girl laughed too much, daydreamed too much, or showed too much interest in anything outside the temple, she was gently reminded through lectures, rituals, and the occasional ominous silence that she was now living a sacred life trademark. And hobbies are not a part of holy lives. The girls were ready by the end of the 10-year training. They were trained, honed into the perfect mix of calm, precision, and existential fear. They were about to enter the next decade, full Vestal duty, whether they were ready or not. Mistakes had consequences, and success meant no one knew you were there. After 10 long years of training, memorizing rituals, mastering sacred silence, and fighting the urge to roll their eyes at omens, a Vestal Virgin finally turned 20, the age at which she was required to serve in full. This was the time when everything mattered. No more, I'm new here. Not anymore. Oops, I forgot. This was the decade when mistakes led to effects on the universe, or at least very dramatic reactions from the Romans. These women were full Vestals, so they didn't just take care of the sacred flame, they turned into the spiritual Swiss Army knife of ancient Rome. Their daily tasks were never ending, very specific, and a little tiring. The main event was feeding the eternal flame. They got the cleanest firewood, made ritual offerings, and took care of Vesta's flame as if they were diffusing a bomb. One wrong move, and the whole city turned into a Reddit thread full of scared people. Emma, the flame went out. Purification through ritual. To keep Rome spiritually clean, Vestals made holy water, incense, salted flour, and other magical things. If one grain fell the wrong way, priests would think the gods were angry right away. Not at themselves, of course, but at the nearest Vestal. Rome's Vests took care of the most important legal documents, wills, treaties, and political secrets, as well as protecting sacred objects. Giving your private papers to a group of scared virgins living under religious watch and taking part in public rituals. Vestals went to ceremonies, festivals, and sacrifices without losing their cool. Imagine being able to watch a bull sacrifice up close and keep a calm face, knowing that if you even flinched, someone would say, "The gods disapproved." You need to keep your purity, not just your physical purity, but also your symbolic purity. Their feelings, movements, clothes, posture, breathing, and probably even their thoughts had to be perfect. People whispered if a Vestal looked tired, if she sneezed during a ceremony, everyone in the temple freaked out, being good luck charms for people in Rome. If a Vestal touched a prisoner on his way to execution, even by accident, he was immediately set free. Picture yourself falling in the forum and letting a murderer go free by mistake. And through all of this, they were supposed to act with calm dignity. No slouching, no whining, and no, "I'm tired of being responsible for the universe." Just the quiet knowledge that they showed how stable Rome was, even though it wasn't very stable. The most powerful and most stressed they were in these 10 years. The vessels were honored, respected, and held to standards that were too high to be true. This is Roman code for "we trust you, but if something goes wrong, it's your fault." After 20 years of training, performing, panicking, not panicking, and keeping a flame that would not go out on its own, the Vestals entered their last decade of teaching. This was the time when they went from being scared apprentices to scary mentors. The ancient version of a senior worker who has seen it all, lived through it all, and now watches new hires with the calm judgment of a marble statue. Teaching was not an option. A Vestal was in charge of training the next group of small, nervous recruits when she turned 30. This meant that she now had to show people how to do things she had once cried about and explain rituals she had once cried about, messed up, and keep the calm authority that comes from standing perfectly still next to a fire for a long time. A senior Vestal had to be a mentor as part of her job. She taught the newbies the sacred chants, led them through hard rituals, and made sure they did their chores every day. The goal was to keep the kids from accidentally calling down God's wrath or knocking over something important, which in Rome was everything, by making sure they followed the rules. This was the time when she finally got to be the one to give warnings like, "Don't run near the sacred flame," and "Don't touch that scroll, it's older than your ancestors." Don't breathe too loudly during purification rites. She probably liked this part deep down. Correcting mistakes. Mistakes during training were normal until a senior Vestal appeared behind you with that stare. You know the one, The look that says, "I've kept this flame alive for 27 years, and I will not let you ruin my record." Teaching ritual mindfulness, not the modern kind with crystals and deep breathing, but the old Roman kind, which meant memorizing 50 steps while holding a grain offering at exactly shoulder height. These weren't written down anywhere, but every senior Vestal had a mental notebook full of wisdom like, "Never trust a priest who says this won't take long." If you hear thunder during a ceremony, pretend it's a good sign. If a senator asks if the gods are angry, the right answer is always no. The answer is always no. Senior Vestals taught the novices the sacred lesson that every Vestal eventually learned. You are vital, you are honored, and you are one badly timed sneeze away from an omen. By the end of this decade, a Vestal had completed her divine career. She had been a student, a servant, a spiritual worker, and now a teacher. A full circle forged in fire, discipline, and 30 years of absolutely no romantic scandals. For all the pressure, fear, and flame-ending terror, the Vestal Virgins. Rome loved to say it honored the Vestals, and for once the empire wasn't exaggerating. These priestesses lived better than most senators and a lot better than the average Roman man who struggled daily with public baths, bad wine, and toga malfunctions. The power of the Vests began the moment they stepped into the public eye. They moved through the streets with a dignity that even the highest magistrates respected. Ordinary women had to be accompanied by fathers, husbands, or whichever male relative hadn't wandered off yet. Vestals. They walked independently. In a society where women were legally closer to household furniture than citizens, the Vestals were practically superheroes. They were granted front row seats at games, an honor usually reserved for Rome's elite men. When a Vestal took her seat at the Colosseum or circus, crowds automatically quieted just a bit because highest magistrates respected. Ordinary women had to be accompanied by fathers, husbands, or whichever male relative hadn't wandered off yet. Vestals. They walked in independently. In a society where women were legally closer to household furniture than citizens, the Vestals were practically superheroes. They were granted front row seats at games, an honor usually reserved for Rome's elite men. When a Vestal took her seat at the Colosseum or circus, crowds automatically quieted just a bit because the gods were also watching if a Vestal was there. The symbolism was strong, and Rome loved symbolism almost as much as it loved public entertainment. Their power wasn't just ceremonial, they could also free prisoners. If a man who was about to be executed touched a Vestal, even by accident, he was instantly free. Imagine having the power to save a life just by being in the wrong place at the right time. That's the kind of divine authority politicians could only dream of. They also had financial freedom. Vestals could own property, write wills, and manage their own money, while other women needed legal guardians for transactions as simple as buying a cup of wine. Vestals were signing contracts and acquiring estates like seasoned professionals. Rome treated them like legal adults while treating everyone else like confused toddlers. Even the law bowed to them. A Vestal's testimony in court carried an extraordinary weight, not because she was infallible, but because Rome thought that the goddess Vesta herself guided her honesty. There was no pressure, of course, just the expectation that everything she said was true. But all this power came with a clear edge. The Vestals were honored because they were important, and they were important because Rome thought disaster was always just around the corner. A Vestal's privilege was balanced by the knowledge that she was always one misinterpreted expression away from becoming an omen. They were revered, they were feared, and maybe most importantly, the city, the priests, and even Vesta herself were always watching them. If there was one rule that Rome cared about more than the sacred flame, it was the Vestal's chastity. The Romans took this vow as seriously as they would a declaration of war or the omens of a slightly confused chicken. A Vestal Virgin had to stay completely, perfectly, and deeply pure for 30 years. Not because Rome cared about her personal morals, but because it believed her chastity was directly linked to the stability of the entire empire. Rome, unsurprisingly, never explained how one woman's love life could topple a civilization of 1 million people. But logic rarely slowed down Roman religion. The theory was simple. Vesta was the goddess of hearth, home, and the sacred flame. Her priestesses embodied her purity. If a Vestal broke her vow, that purity cracked, and Rome's metaphorical household collapsed. The city acted as if the Vests were holding a cosmic Jenga tower together, with only their willpower and chastity. The expectations were harsh. Vestals were always surrounded by guards, rules, and the nagging feeling that a god was watching them with divine binoculars. They could walk freely in the city, but freedom isn't freedom if people are scanning your face for any sign of romantic scandal. A Vestal could trip on the street, and half the forum would whisper, "She's in love," followed by an immediate senate, talking about possible signs. Roman men, of course, didn't have to make the same vow. A senator could have 3 wives, 12 mistresses, and a lot of household help, and no one would care. But if a Vestal made meaningful eye contact with someone at a festival, the priests would start sharpening their shovels. It was such an obvious double standard that even the ancient historians rolled their eyes. Staying chaste wasn't just about not having sex. Vestals also had to stay away from situations that might look. A private conversation, dangerous. A smile lasting half a second too long, concerning. Standing too close to a handsome equestrian, treasonous. The Vestals weren't just celibate, they were living symbols of purity, expected to float through life like divine statues who occasionally performed fire maintenance. And the worst part, there was no second chance. One accusation, founded or not, could destroy a career, a reputation, and quite literally a life. Rome held the Vestals on a pedestal so high that the only direction left to fall was catastrophic. This was the paradox of being a Vestal Virgin. Absolute honor balanced on the edge of absolute ruin. If a Vestal Virgin broke her vow of chastity, Rome didn't treat it as a private matter, a personal mistake, or even a scandal. No, it became a full-blown cosmic crisis. Romans believed that the purity of a Vestal wasn't just symbolic, it was the city's spiritual life support system. So, if a Vestal's vow shattered, the solution had to be equally dramatic. And Rome never did anything halfway, so they came up with one of the most theatrical punishments in ancient history: burying her alive. Yes, alive, because apparently the Romans took the phrase overreaction as divine instruction. But there was a twist. Rome prided itself on being civilized, which meant they could not legally execute a Vestal. She was, after all, a sacred woman belonging to the goddess Vesta. So they created a loophole so large and so morally questionable that even a Roman lawyer would squint at it. They put the vessel in an underground room with a bed, a lamp, water, and a little food, and then they sealed it up. Technically, they weren't killing her, they were just putting her somewhere she would eventually die on her own. Rome always finds creative ways to justify its drama. The ritual began with a public trial. The accused Vestal stood before the pontiff, Fex Maximus, usually trembling beneath layers of symbolic purity and sheer terror. The priests asked her a series of questions, not so much to seek truth, but to check a box on the ritual checklist. After all, once Rome smelled scandal, facts became optional. The accused Vestal could proclaim innocence until her voice broke. But Rome, in its superstitious frenzy, rarely cared. A bad harvest, a solar eclipse, or an unfortunate pigeon omen could doom her as easily as actual guilt. The procession to the execution site was a grim parade. The Vestal was placed in a closed litter so no one could see her and no one could risk accidentally touching her. Heaven forbid a doomed. The priestess accidentally freed a criminal on her way to the grave. The people watched in silence because nothing makes a society behave like watching its spiritual leaders punished with geological enthusiasm. Meanwhile, the man involved, if he existed, was whipped to death in the Forum, a sentence that Rome carried out with disturbingly casual efficiency. In the end, the burial alive ritual revealed everything about Rome's relationship with the Vests. They were essential, revered, and terrifyingly. The moment a superstition turned against them, they were disposable. If you think modern politics thrives on scandal, ancient Rome would like to raise you one Vestal Virgin. Nothing electrified the city quite like whispers that a Vestal had broken her vow. It didn't matter whether it was true, partly true, or invented by a senator having a slow news week. The mere hint of impropriety sent Rome spiraling into moral panic faster than you can say "apicious omens." Unfortunately, the Vestals lived in the most politically weaponizable position imaginable. They were at the crossroads of religion, superstition, and public fear, a perfect storm for accusations. A Vestal didn't have to do anything wrong. She just had to look a little stressed during a ritual or sneeze at the wrong time, and half of the Senate would think it was a sign of divine displeasure. The other half used it as a chance to ruin someone's career. Politicians loved Vestal scandals. They were the Swiss Army knife of political tools, useful for distracting the public, getting rid of rivals, or making everyone think that Jupiter hated your enemies more than he hated you. If a powerful man wanted to bring down an enemy, accusing that enemy of seducing a Vestal was the ancient version of dropping a nuke. After all, who could argue with the gods? The public played along with shocking enthusiasm. Romans adored drama. If a Vestal was suspected of wrongdoing, crowds filled the forum, whispering interpretations and inventing symptoms of divine anger. A slightly crooked lightning bolt, a bad harvest, or a crow sitting on the wrong temple roof were all signs that the universe was sending hints. And clearly, those hints pointed directly at the Vestal in question. The city turned into a live-action conspiracy forum. And the trials, oh, the trials, they weren't trials so much as performance art. The accused Vestal stood there as priests recited rituals, senators delivered dramatic speeches, and the public stared with the intensity of people watching a gladiator match they didn't realize was actually about religion. Evidence was harvest, a crow sitting on the wrong temple roof. Clearly, the universe was sending hints, and clearly, those hints pointed directly at the Vestal in question. The city turned into a live-action conspiracy forum, and the trials, oh, the trials, they weren't trials so much as performance art. The accused Vestal stood there as priests recited rituals, senators delivered dramatic speeches, and the public stared with the intensity of people watching a gladiator match they didn't realize was actually about religion. Evidence was. Vibes were enough. If Rome felt unlucky that year, the Vestal was guilty. Even innocent Vestals weren't safe. Some were sacrificed to restore public confidence, others to satisfy political vendettas, and a few simply because Rome believed disasters couldn't possibly be random. Someone, preferably a woman with a spotless record, had to take the fall. In the end, Vestal scandals reminded everyone of Rome's deepest fear, chaos. And nothing soothed that fear quite like blaming a young woman who had dedicated her life to keeping things from getting out of hand. Rome was a civilization that was proud of its engineering, military strength, and ability to conquer continents while wearing skirts. But when it came to one thing, the sacred flame going out, Rome could be surprisingly weak. You would think that a city with aqueducts, concrete, and a whole military-industrial complex would be able to handle a simple fire problem calmly. But no. When the eternal flame went out, Rome acted like someone had unplugged the gods. Life support machine. When the flame went out, and yes, it did happen more often than the priests wanted to admit, the city plunged into instant spiritual crisis mode. People in the forum gasped dramatically. Priests scrambled like chickens, fleeing a thunderstorm, and senators immediately blamed foreign influence, political rivals, or the ominous shape of last night's clouds. Because in Rome, everything had meaning, even accidents. The Vestal responsible usually froze in horror because she knew exactly what was. A sudden, very public reminder that Romans did not believe in mistakes. Everyone had a theory about why the flame failed. Some blamed divine anger. Some blamed poor ritual execution. Some blamed the girl's posture, breathing, or aura. No one blamed the fact that maintaining a fire in an open air temple during a windy Mediterranean night is frankly kind of difficult. The penalty for letting the flame die was a beating, not a severe one according to Roman priests. But Roman priests were not known for their gentle approach to discipline. This punishment was carried out in a darkened place, supposedly to preserve the Vestal's dignity. Of course, being whipped in a small dark room was hardly dignified, but at least Rome liked to pretend. Meanwhile, the rest of the city performed massive purification rituals to reboot the spiritual system. Animals were sacrificed, prayers were chanted, incense burned until half the forum smelled like a divine barbecue, and a new fire was lit using the purest means available. Sunlight was often focused through a device that looked like a magnifying glass. The gods seemed to prefer solar energy. The whole thing was not just a religious emergency, it was also a political performance. Rome needed to show the gods and itself that it was still in charge. A rate flame meant hope. A punished Vestal meant accountability. A completed ritual meant that stability had somehow been restored, but everyone knew the truth. The Vestals were human, the flame was fickle, and Rome, for all its grandeur, could be undone by something as simple as a gust of wind. After 30 years of serving the gods, tending an anxiety-inducing flame, performing rituals with flawless precision, and living under the perpetual threat of burial, the Vestal Virgins reached a milestone that must have felt like divine salvation. Retirement. The moment a Vestal completed her 3-decade service, she was finally free to rejoin the mortal world. A world she hadn't lived in since childhood and was probably half convinced no longer existed. Retirement turned a woman into something rare in Rome, a woman with complete legal independence. She could own property, make contracts, manage her money, buy land, sell land, sue people, and most shockingly, live without a male guardian watching her every move. In a society where even wealthy women needed permission to sneeze in the general direction of a marketplace, former Vestals were walking examples of freedom. Many Romans wanted to marry retired Vestals because they thought their purity and divine connection brought good luck. After all, what better way to bless your home than to marry someone who had spent the 30 years staring into a holy fire while standing perfectly still? Wealthy men lined up, hoping to find a wife who would bring them cosmic approval, stable luck, and a lower chance of household curses. But here's the twist. Most retired Vestals didn't marry. After decades of complete freedom and spiritual authority, the idea of suddenly reporting to a husband must have sounded about as appealing as returning to the burial chamber they had narrowly avoided. Imagine being free after 30 years and then immediately losing your independence because Publius wants someone to manage his villa. No thanks. Those who did marry sometimes struggled to adjust. Life outside the house of the Vestals was noisy, unpredictable, and full of people who didn't understand basic ritual etiquette. Ordinary citizens made mistakes constantly, touching sacred objects incorrectly, ignoring omens, failing to maintain pure thoughts during festivals. A former Vestal might see a problem in one household and almost instinctively perform a purification ceremony. Still, retirement had its perks. A former Vestal could walk around the city without being watched like a divine barometer. She could enjoy festivals without worrying that her smile was being analyzed for cosmic meaning. She could go to the market and buy a piece of fruit without thinking about its ritual symbolism. In short, she could live like a person, not a myth. Snorts. Yet the public never fully let go of the. There was an aura around retired vessels. People still whispered blessings when they passed. Children stared in awe. Some citizens believed that even in retirement, a Vestal carried a spark of the sacred flame within her. And maybe she did, but now, at last, it was hers. For nearly 1,000 years, the Vestal Virgins stood at the center of Rome's spiritual identity. Through civil wars, assassinations, plagues, imperial scandals, and emperors who really should have been supervised, the Vests kept the flame burning. They were the quiet constant in a city that never stopped yelling. But everything in Rome, even the most sacred traditions, eventually collided with history's favorite hobby, change. By the late 4th century CE, the Roman Empire was shifting dramatically. Christianity was rising with the enthusiasm of a new startup backed by divine venture capital, and traditional Roman religion was steadily losing government funding. Old gods were out, new doctrines were in, and suddenly people looked at the eternal flame and flame burning. They were the quiet constant in a city that never stopped yelling. But everything in Rome, even the most sacred traditions, eventually collided with history's favorite hobby, change. By the late 4th century CE, the Roman Empire was shifting dramatically. Christianity was rising with the enthusiasm of a new startup backed by divine venture capital, and traditional Roman religion was steadily losing government funding. Old gods were out, new doctrines were in, and suddenly people looked at the eternal flame and said, "Do we really need this?" This is a dangerous question in any time, but especially in Rome, where people used to kill animals because Mercury was having a bad day. Then came Emperor Theodosius I, whose life goal seemed to be to erase Rome's pagan past like old files on a dusty divine computer. In 394 CE, he issued the order that ended the Vestal Order. The Temple of Vesta, once the spiritual heart of the city, fell silent. The sacred flame that generations of priests had protected went out forever. The terrified priestesses had protected the flame with the dedication of overworked interns, but it was put out forever. Some people were horrified, while others were superstitious and waited nervously for earthquakes, plagues, or angry gods to drop thunderbolts on the forum. But the world didn't immediately collapse. Crops didn't fail, volcanoes didn't erupt in dramatic protest, and life went on. People slowly realized that Rome wouldn't implode just because 6 women weren't, standing guard over a sacred bonfire. But the symbolic impact was enormous. The extinguishing of the flame marked the end of Rome's ancient religious identity. The Vests, once untouchable figures of purity and prestige, now found themselves relics of a fading world. Some were absorbed into aristocratic households, others quietly retired, and a few remained in Rome as living reminders of an age slipping away. The House of the Vests fell into disuse, its elegant courtyard eventually filling with rubble and silence. Statues, the fountains dried up, the cracks appeared, and the marble halls that used to echo with whispered prayers and ritual footsteps became ruins, ironically, better preserved than many Roman marriages. And maybe that's the sad truth. The Vestal Virgins didn't end because they failed. They ended because Rome changed. Their flame wasn't put out by disaster, scandal, or divine punishment. It was put out because the empire that made them finally changed its identity. The last flicker of Vesta's fire faded into history, and with it, one of the most extraordinary sisterhoods the ancient world ever knew. When people think of the Middle Ages, they usually think of wars, plagues, or huge castles. But underneath that rough, disciplined surface, medieval life was full of games, contests, and physical challenges that shaped identity just as much as faith or feudal duty. In medieval times, play was not a luxury. It was a social force, a way to keep order, build strength, make friends, and test courage in. A world where strength and honor were as real as silver. Medieval games were different because they showed class so well. A nobleman and a farmhand could both be athletic, but they had very different ideas of what sports were. For peasants, daily work already required physical strength. Farming, chopping wood, hauling water, and caring for animals built natural endurance. So when peasants got together to play, they liked rough, community-centered games like wrestling in fields after the harvest. They played games that were like tag or kicked a rough leather ball around the village green. Their games were loud, spontaneous, and often chaotic, which was a nice break from work that rarely ended before sunset. Nobles, on the other hand, practiced sports that helped them get ready for war. They fenced with dull swords to improve their reflexes, trained with lances to improve their aim for tournaments, and practiced archery to build the muscle groups they needed on the battlefield. Their games had ceremony, banners, and other decorations. Attendants watched as the nobles' play fluttered in the courtyard, and the rules were strictly followed. A noble's play was a rehearsal for conflict wrapped in silk and honor. Even relaxing games like hunting or hawking were tied to status, requiring land, equipment, and trained animals that only the elite could afford. But despite these differences, medieval society agreed on one thing: games revealed character. Winning through strength was admirable, but winning through cleverness, persistence, or courage was even better. This belief connected everything from a monk thinking about his next move in a chess game to a young squire learning how to use a long sword while his lord watched. Even the church, which was often strict, knew that play was important. Some monasteries allowed board games like early chess or Hanatafel to help people think strategically. For villages and noble courts alike, games weren't just distractions. They were a part of the culture, shaping relationships, rank, and identity in a world defined by hierarchy and struggle. In the Middle Ages, archery wasn't just a hobby. It was a skill for survival and, in many cultures, a legal duty. The bow became the great equalizer across England, especially allowing commoners to change the fate of kingdoms. Because of this, archery quickly became the most serious game for the lower and middle classes, mixing sport, military training, and national identity. For peasants, archery meant food and protection. A skilled archer could bring home rabbits, birds, or even small deer, giving their family a priceless edge during harsh seasons. But archery was also a defense against danger. Raiders, wolves, rival lords. The bow was affordable, and more importantly, it could be learned without noble lineage. This accessibility made it deeply woven into rural culture. On Sundays or feast days, villagers gathered in open fields to test their aim, wagering drinks, bread, or bragging rights. These competitions were lively, filled with laughter, teasing, and the clack of arrows hitting wooden targets. However, archery was a strategic necessity for kings. English monarchs famously required all able bodied men to practice on weekends and holidays. Laws were passed forbidding frivolous games like dice or football, commanding men to shoot instead. Monarchs knew that an army of trained archers, even poor ones, could decide battles, and they were right. At Crécy, Pouilly, and Azincourt, ordinary archers humbled armored knights and reshaped medieval warfare. The long bow was brutal to master. It required immense strength, with some bows pulling over 100 pounds. Archers trained not just their arms, but their entire upper bodies, backs, shoulders, and core, often developing distinctive asymmetrical muscles that skeletal remains still reveal today. Because of how physically demanding it was, competition served as both sport and conditioning. To excel meant endurance, patience, and instincts sharpened by countless hours outdoors. Among nobles, archery had a different flavor. They practiced with recurved. The longbow was mostly used by commoners for hunting or display, while the sport was associated with elegance for them. They would show off their skills in falconry, mounted archery, or precision shots during court festivals. Archery represented discipline and control for everyone, regardless of class. Each shot was a test of balance, breath, and calm. To draw a bow was to face gravity, wind, and your own nerves. For medieval people, hitting a target with an arrow wasn't just a victory, it was a reflection of character in a world where strength and skill meant survival. If archery showed off precision and discipline, wrestling showed off the raw, unfiltered power of medieval life. This was the sport of farmhands, mill workers, shepherd boys, and travelers. A test of muscle, balance, and stubborn determination. Wrestling didn't need any special equipment, training ground, or noble title. All it needed was open space, two willing opponents, and a crowd eager for a contest that was as much social theater as sport. In wrestling matches were part of festivals, markets, and feast day celebrations in villages all over Europe. After long days of work, men would challenge each other to fights that were both friendly and serious. The stakes could be a jug of ale a loaf of bread, a kiss from the girl handing out ribbons, or just the honor of being the strongest man in the village. These contests weren't completely lawless. Most followed unwritten rules, like no hitting, gouging, or biting. You won by throwing your opponent to the ground, or forcing him to give up. But even with these rules, the matches could be very competitive, leaving people with bruises, sprains, and sometimes broken bones. Because peasants had to work hard, their bodies naturally got used to grappling. Wrestling was a way to let off steam and settle arguments without getting into serious fights. A man who was insulted at the tavern might say, "Come outside, not to duel with knives, but to settle things with a clean throw in the dirt." Dirt. Winning gave you status. When you lost, you had to buy drinks and laugh and tease your friends. The upper classes also had their own styles of wrestling, but they were more formal and structured. As part of their military training, knights learned how to throw opponents while wearing armor and how to wrestle well when they were not on horseback. The German School of Combat even wrote down specific holds, locks, and moves for armored wrestling in their manuals. A reminder that chivalry was very polite, but medieval warfare could get very personal across Europe. Different styles of fighting developed in different parts of the world. Cornish wrestling has its own jackets, Breton wrestling has big throws, and Scandinavian wrestling is based on Viking tradition. These changes were based on the culture of the area, but the main part of the sport stayed the same. Two people showing their strength and bravery by being physically strong. In the past, wrestling was like weightlifting, martial arts, and socializing all rolled into one, a mix of fun and games. It showed people's true colors, helped them make friends, and sometimes ended fights. A simple game that carries the complicated feelings of everyday life in the Middle Ages. If wrestling was about strength and archery was about discipline, medieval football was just a mess of tradition. This was a sport that only regular people could play. It was loud, dirty, happy, and sometimes even dangerous. Forget about the rules, uniforms, and refs you might think of today. Football in the Middle Ages was more like there was a fight in the whole village, and a ball was somewhere under the pile. People loved it as one of the most spirited forms of group play in the Middle Ages, even though it was violent. Most of the time, matches took place on holidays like Easter, Shrove Tuesday, or village festivals. Two big groups, sometimes whole parishes, would meet in open fields, narrow alleys, or the long stretches of countryside that separate towns. The goal could be a church door, a tree, a riverbank, or even the village square of the other team. There was no set number of players. There could be 10 people or hundreds of people who take part. There were no boundaries in the field, so the game could go into rivers, barns, or even the odd market stall that wasn't very lucky. There was only one real rule: get the ball to your side's goal without killing anyone. And sometimes people took that last condition as more of a suggestion. You could tackle, push, shoulder check, and grapple. No one cared if they lost a shoe, ripped a tunic, or were pushed face first into a pile of poop during the game. People often got hurt. like breaking their noses, spraining their ankles, or breaking their ribs. But there was also laughter, cheering, and the kind of excitement that made the whole village feel alive. The ball could be anything from a leather wrapped bundle of cloth to an inflated animal bladder. Some villages put the ball in water to make it heavier and harder to handle. Others put charms or ribbons on their team to make them lucky. Even though things were crazy, football played an important social role. It brought neighbors together, eased tensions, and made the community feel more like itself. A win meant being proud. When they lost, they complained more, made jokes, and promised to win next year. But not everyone liked the sport. Kings in the Middle Ages tried many times to make football illegal because they thought it was violent, disruptive, and kept people from practicing archery. But the bans didn't work very often. People liked it too much. They owned football, not the crown. For peasants who worked hard for lords and seasons, medieval football gave them something that can't be bought. 90 minutes of unrestrained freedom, muddy friendship, and the chance to feel powerful in a world where they didn't often have power. While peasants fought in fields and chased muddy footballs, nobles played sports that looked more like graceful, refined, and powerful performances. Hawking and hunting were the most important activities for the aristocracy, combining athletic skill with showmanship and deep meaning. These activities were more than just games, they were statements of status. If you rode through a forest with a falcon on your glove or a pack of hounds racing ahead, everyone would know your rank before you even said a word. People really liked hawking, which is also called falconry. To train a bird of prey, you needed to be patient, disciplined, and surprisingly gentle. A noble could spend months getting to know a kestrel, peregrine, or goshawk. To keep the bird calm, it had to be fed by hand, gently covered with a hood, and given treats at just the right times. When the falcon's flight was beautiful when they all came together on the hunt. A sudden flash of wings, a line in the sky, and then a precise hit on its target. The noble who owned the bird shared in its glory. This sport required a lot of skill, intelligence, and practiced grace. But hunting was much more physical and dramatic. Horses that could run fast, horn calls that echoed through the woods, and well-trained hounds that could jump over roots and streams were all part of mounted hunts. The target, which is usually a deer, boar, or fox, beaters or dogs, drove it out into the open, where the noble riders could show off their bravery, speed, and skill with their horses. Half the fun was the chase itself. It took real athleticism to crash through brush, jump over fallen logs, and weave through tangled paths. But hunting also helped to keep the social order in the Middle Ages. There were rights in forests, and only the nobility could hunt certain animals or certain areas of land. If a peasant is caught poaching, they could face harsh punishment, including fines and jail time, or even cutting off body parts in the most brutal areas. Because only a few people could do it, the hunt was more than just a sport. It was a way to show off power. The animals, the land, the weapons, and even the clothes. Tunic with lots of embroidery, feathered hats, and shiny boots all showed that you were important. Hawking and hunting were also useful for the military in real life. A noble who was good at following prey or controlling a fast moving horse had an edge in battle. Quick reflexes, sharp observation, and bravery in the face of sudden movement led directly to be ready to march. For nobles, these sports were a show of status. There was a graceful dance of power in the woods, fields, and open skies. If hawking was graceful and hunting was honorable, tournaments were just for show. A huge event that combined the medieval versions of a championship finals match, a parade, and a battlefield rehearsal. Tournaments were not just fun for knights. They were chances to become famous, rich, and well liked by noble courts. For regular people, they were amazing shows of power and drama, and for most people, they were the closest they would ever come to seeing real chivalric combat. Before the first lance broke, the tournament had already started. Weeks of work turned fields into lively arenas with colorful tents, family crests, and bright banners. Merchants came early to sell roasted meats, sweet pastries, ribbons in the colors of the house, and cheap souvenirs. As jugglers and acrobats warmed up to entertain the crowd, minstrels tuned their instruments. More and more people. Nobles came in a line, wearing embroidered clothes and silk cloaks that sparkled in the sun. Everyone was on edge. The knights, who were armored, well behaved, and eager to show what they could do, were at the center of the event. The most famous competition was jousting. Two knights on horseback charged at each other with wooden lances, trying to hit their opponent's shield cleanly or knock them off their horse. When done right, the sound of the impact was like thunder. Wood that has broken flew, horses reared, and the crowd went wild. It was violence that was controlled by strict rules, but every pass took guts. One mistake or slip could break bones or end a career. Tournaments had more than just jousting. They also had melee battles, which were chaotic but organized group fights that tested teamwork and close combat skills. Knights fought each other in swirling clouds of dust, with swords clashing and shields breaking. Even though the weapons were dull, injuries were common. But these fights were important practice because they were like the unpredictability of real warfare lets knights come up with plans and improve their reflexes when they're under stress. Winning brought huge rewards. A knight who wins a battle might get the armor, horse, or ransom of the person he beat, which could make him very rich and raise his status. Even more valuable was the praise of noble people, especially women, who gave knights tokens of favor, like embroidered scarves or flowers, which they proudly wore on their helmets. But tournaments weren't just for the best. Commoners loved them, cheering loudly, placing bets, and talking about every punch for weeks after. For one amazing afternoon, the strict medieval hierarchy broke down as everyone, from peasants to nobles, enjoyed the show. Tournaments were the biggest celebration of medieval sport and martial skill because they combined athleticism, honor, and pageantry. Not every medieval contest involved weapons, muscle, or mud. Some fights happened quietly over wooden tables where minds clashed. Instead of people, board games like chess, Hannafel, backgammon, and dice were a big part of medieval fun. Depending on who was playing, these games could be used to train the mind, make friends, or even make political moves. Chess came to Europe from the Islamic world and quickly became the game of choice for the upper class. The game had a lot of pawns, knights, bishops, and queens, which made it feel like a metaphor for feudal society as well as a strategy game. To be good at chess, you had to show intelligence, patience, and foresight, which are all traits that people in court life admired. A nobleman who was good at the board might impress lords and ladies with his wit as much as with his riding or fencing. Chess was used as a way to settle disagreements in some courts. Rivals challenged each other's minds, and alliances grew stronger through hours of quiet, thoughtful play. Monasteries also liked to play board games, especially early chess and Nefotel, contrary to the stereotype of joyless. Monks liked games that made them think strategically and gave them a break from the hard work of living in a cloister. Some abbots thought these kinds of games were good for monks because they taught them how to resist temptation, plan their spiritual study, and meditate more deeply. A monk thinking about a smart move wasn't that different from one thinking about a religious question. Both needed to be clear and disciplined. Most of the time, people played dice games in taverns, inns, and back alleys. Peasants, merchants, and soldiers played them for small bets, using bone-carved cubes that made a lot of noise when they hit rough wooden tables. These games were quick, loud, and hard to stop playing. They could make friends into enemies in a matter of minutes, and they were known for starting fights, making people laugh, and even getting drunk and fighting. People in the Middle Ages didn't like gambling with dice because they thought it took time away from work and moral duty. But no amount of yelling or fines ever made people stop playing. Backgammon is also called tables, was another thing that people did for fun. It was a mix of skill and chance that appealed to people who wanted to compete, but didn't want the randomness of dice alone. Soldiers played it between battles. Nobles played it in their halls on quiet evenings, and merchants played it while they were on the road. In the Middle Ages, board games were a way to test the mind, just like physical sports were a way to test the body. The sound of pieces clacking and the tension of strategy brought people together, whether they were in a monastery cloister or a smoky tavern. Together across social lines. Adults fenced, hunted, and wrestled, but medieval kids played games that used their imaginations, copied what they saw, and surprisingly built useful skills. The Middle Ages had short childhoods. A lot of kids started working when they were 7 or 8, but play was still an important part of their daily lives. It taught them how to work together, be brave, be creative, and make friends long before they had to work hard as adults. Kids played with the things they had. Families with more money gave carved wooden toys, tiny shields, cloth dolls, wooden horses, and small carts. Some noble kids even practiced with toy swords made of padded leather to get ready for the roles they were supposed to play. A young boy who was going to be a knight might spend hours pretending to protect a castle made of stacked firewood. A young girl from a noble family might use her dolls to act out banquets or festivals, learning how to behave in a polite way and how to act in court. For them, play was practice for being an adult. On the other hand, kids in the village depended on nature and their own resourcefulness. They made toys out of sticks, mud, straw, and stones. A ball was made out of a round bundle of rags. A piece of cloth tied around a reed made a doll. A branch that was bent became a bow. They played games that were fun and full of energy, running races on narrow paths, climbing trees, chasing each other through fields, and skipping stones across ponds. One popular game was Blind Man's Buff, in which a child with a blindfold on tried to catch other kids by sound. By themselves, making the air full of laughter and playful screams. Kids also played pretend sports that they saw adults do. Boys who were young practiced wrestling in soft dirt or tried to hit straw targets with blunt arrows. Girls also took part, especially in games like tag, rolling hoops, singing circles, and skipping stones. Many people today think that medieval childhood was completely divided by gender, but this isn't true. In a lot of rural areas, kids could play together without any adult responsibilities getting in the way. Playing board games and telling stories were also big parts of kids' fun. Simple dice games taught math and chants, and riddles and songs kept local stories alive. Kids loved listening to traveling minstrels, and then they acted out the stories themselves in small shows they put on under trees or in barns. Even chores turned into games. Getting water became a race. Taking care of geese turned into a game of pretending the flock was a military unit. It was an excuse to draw patterns in the dust when you swept the yard. Playtime for kids, in all its forms, was a very important part of life in the Middle Ages. A world where young people could use their imaginations even when things were hard, and where they could learn the skills, bravery, and sense of community they needed to become adults. Games and sports were not separate events in the Middle Ages. During festivals and feast days, when whole communities took a break from their daily lives, they grew the most. These parties turned villages, towns, and even castle courtyards into lively places where people of all social classes mixed, rivalries grew, and the rhythms of work were replaced by laughter, noise, and athletic displays. Sports at festivals meant more than just having fun. It strengthened people's sense of who they were, healed rifts, and reminded them that they were part of something bigger than themselves. The agricultural and religious calendars were linked to festivals. After the harvest, when the barns were full and work slowed down, villages had days of feasting, music, and friendly competition to celebrate. Football games swept through the fields. People cheered on the wrestling pits. People who watched archery contests gave proud farmers a chance to show off their skills in front of their neighbors and visiting lords. Winners got ribbons, bread, ale, or just the honor of having their name linked to strength or accuracy for the rest of the year. Nobles could show off their wealth and kindness at festivals. Lords paid for sports events and gave out prizes like cloaks, silver cups, or animals. Their support wasn't just for the sake of charity, it made it stronger. Faithfulness. A peasant who got a sheep or a bag of coins from his lord felt proud, respected, and more connected to the feudal system. At the same time, nobles showed off their skills in fencing matches, riding shows, and ceremonial hunts, which reminded everyone of the martial ideals that made them important. Religious holidays were a mix of spiritual devotion and community happiness. On feast days for saints, villages would play games that stood for renewal and blessing. Tug of war games were a sign of the fight between good and bad. Dancing and singing together showed that everyone was together. People laughed as kids played games. Even monks, who usually stick to strict schedules, would sometimes set up small competitions or board games to celebrate important holy days. Markets and trade fairs added to the fun. Traders from faraway places brought foreign games, strange trinkets, and performers who traveled. Jugglers, tumblers, musicians, and fake fighters kept people entertained, making it hard to tell the difference between sports and entertainment and show. These meetings brought in new ideas and ways to play, which opened up the medieval mind to things outside of local customs. There was always a simple truth at the heart of every festival. Sports brought people together. People in the Middle Ages got back in touch with each other by doing things like wrestling, archery, or playing football in the mud. For a while, exhaustion, hierarchy, and hardship disappeared, and in their place came celebration, community, and the joy of playing together. There was a lot of heat, dust, and noise in Babylon. Ambition that won't let you rest. The perfect stage for a king who had spent his whole life looking for the end of the world. In early June of 323 BCE, the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, which was usually full of soldiers, scribes, and messengers, became strangely quiet. Word spread like crazy. Alexander, the undefeated general who had taken over lands from Greece to the edges of India, was very sick. Men who had marched with him through deserts and monsoons now stood outside his door, unable to do anything but wait for news that never came. To get better, Alexander had been making plans for new campaigns just a few weeks before. His mind was always racing, and he thought of conquering Arabia, building huge shipyards, and finding new trade routes to connect his huge empire. Babylon was going to be the empire's beautiful capital, a place where Greek and Persian cultures came together to make something new and exciting. Alexander went around the marshes, checked out the ports, and made offerings to the gods. He drank with his friends, threw parties, and talked about places he wanted to go. Still not taken. Back then, there was no sign that his life would end before summer. Then the fever hit. It started off quietly, almost like nothing was wrong. Alexander complained of a sharp pain after drinking wine at a banquet in honor of his admiral Nous. Some people said he shook. Some said he screamed and held his side. At first, he brushed it off and said he was too tired from all the planning, but by the next morning, he could barely walk. His generals took him back to his chambers, sure that the great king would recover quickly, stubbornly, and almost like magic, as he always did. But the fever wouldn't go away. Over the next few days, Alexander's mind came and went. The man who had crossed the Hindu Kush and fought elephants and storms at sea was now having trouble talking. His voice, which used to be strong enough to get thousands of people to join him, had become a whisper. His fever made his eyes hurt. His body, which usually didn't move, felt heavy and unresponsive. Outside his room, thousands of soldiers gathered, begging for any sign of betterment. They prayed to Greek gods, Babylonian gods, and any other power they thought might save the king who had led them around the world. The heat of Babylon pressed down on the dark palace rooms. Incense burned, doctors whispered, and Alexander the Great sat on a low couch, surrounded by the anxious silence of his empire. He was facing the first enemy he could not defeat. Alexander had survived injuries that would have killed most people. An arrow through the lung in India, and a broken skull from a siege engine in the Balkans, and many cuts, bruises, and infections from years of fighting. His soldiers thought he had a kind of divine strength, like a spark of Heracles or Achilles burning inside him. But in Babylon, all of those old wounds, the stress of marching all the time, and the fatigue of being in charge finally caught up with them. His body, which had been shaped by discipline and battle, started to fall apart very quickly. The fever got worse. At first, he could sit up straight and give short orders to generals and scribes, but every day took more out of him. He couldn't walk without help by the third day. His arms and legs felt heavy, like they were full of wet sand. He was sweating so much that it soaked the fine linens underneath him. He was in pain even when he turned his head. His doctors did everything they could think of from the past. Baths that are warm, cool compresses, wine with herbs, and prayers to Asclepius. Nothing worked. Anxiety spread outside like smoke. Alexander's army was made up of tough veterans who had followed him from Macedon to the ends of the world. They had seen him hurt, bleeding, angry, and laughing, but never helpless. Now they were all huddled together around the palace gates, whispering about signs. Some people said that the gods were punishing him for burning Pepilolis. Some people said that jealous generals had poisoned him. Some people dared to hope that he would come back to life, healed by the divine spirits he called on so often. The truth was much simpler and much crueler inside his room. Alexander was getting weaker, his hunger gone, his breathing got shallower, his fever got so high that he started to lose his mind and mutter half-formed plans for future campaigns. He tried to stand up once, saying he needed to check on his fleet's preparations, but his legs gave out, and only the quick reflexes of his guards kept him from falling. He couldn't talk clearly anymore by the seventh day. He pointed weakly at maps on the wall instead of speaking, trying to communicate without words. His friends, men like Tommy, Pedicus, and Hestians old, friends stood by helplessly as the unstoppable king, who had never backed down in battle, now fell silent. There was always the sound of sandals shuffling around the palace, the smell of incense, and the unbearable weight of waiting. News spread quickly. It was no longer just a worry about Alexander's health. It killed them, the man who had run away from death for 10 years and conquered Asia was finally being caught. As Alexander's fever got worse, the mood in the palace changed from worry to pure fear. His friends, the men who had fought with him for more than 10 years, were not just officers. They were childhood friends, brothers in arms, and political enemies all at the same time. As Alexander got weaker, their bond started to break. Every quiet talk was like the weight of an empire. Every look they exchanged showed doubt, ambition, or fear. Paticus, one of Alexander's most trusted commanders and the king's bodyguard, took up his post as guardian of the king's chambers. He decided which generals could see Alexander and when they could do so. Some people thought this was loyalty, while others thought it was the first step in a power grab. Tomley, the shrewd and charming general who had always kept a strategic distance, watched Picus closely, already judging the changing balance of power. The old veterans, Craterus, Seleucus, and Antipas supporters, thought the empire was going to fall apart before their king even died. In the heat of Babylon, rumors spread like flies. One group whispered that Antipas' sons, Cassander or Eololus, had poisoned Alexander. Another group blamed Meleager, who had just had a fight with Perdiccas over military promotions. Others whispered about curses, prophecies, and divine jealousy, that the gods had finally had enough of a mortal claiming to be their equal. There was a lot of suspicion in the palace halls because there wasn't enough clear information. The friends took turns sitting by Alexander's bed. They saw their king having trouble breathing and his skin sweating from a fever. Some held his hand, some prayed, and some thought about what to do next without saying anything. They had followed the unbreakable will of one man for years. Now that will was flickering like a torch in the wind, and no one knew what would happen when it went out. The soldiers from Macedonia who were camped outside grew impatient. They wanted to see their king. They wanted to be sure that he would get better. They wanted someone to tell them what would happen next, no matter who it was. They were men without a leader without Alexander, thousands of miles from home, surrounded by people who had been conquered and could rise at any moment. The tension was so high that it could have led to violence. The companions, who were usually so sure of themselves in battle, now felt stuck. Without Alexander's voice to guide them, they became anxious shadows. Armies could take over empires, but fear could also make them fall apart. Everyone knew the truth they were afraid to say during those suffocating days when the palace shook with doubt. The fate of the world rested on one man who was dying. As Alexander's health got worse, Babylon changed from a royal capital to a pressure cooker that was about to blow up. Outside the palace gates, thousands of Macedonian soldiers who had spent 10 years conquering were gathering in large groups. These were the men who had traveled with Alexander through deserts, over frozen mountain passes, and into the heart of empires. In battle, they had stood shield to shield with him. They had put friends to rest next to him. And now, as rumors of his death spread, they wanted to see him with their own eyes as news of his death spread. But Pedicus and the other commanders were unsure, letting thousands of heavily armed, scared, and grieving warriors into the palace, which could have led to violence right away. The mood in the ranks was already unstable. If their king died, soldiers were afraid they would be left alone in a foreign land. They were afraid that the Greek troops would rebel. They were afraid that the cities Alexander had taken over would rise up in revenge. What they were most afraid of was the unknown. Who would lead them in Alexander's absence? Who would give them money? Who would take them home? It was a dangerous combination. Loyalty turning into need. The generals tried to keep the soldiers away from the palace, but the men yelled. They said their leaders were hiding the truth and planning to take over the empire themselves. Some soldiers threw rocks at messengers. Others yelled Alexander's name and beat their shields until their throats hurt. The stress broke when a group of infantrymen tried to get to the palace entrance, but elite royal guards stopped them. For a second, swords almost came out. The two sides didn't fight because they were afraid of dishonoring Alexander. Finally, the commanders gave in so that there wouldn't be an open revolt. One of the most terrifying scenes in ancient history happened. The king was dying and could hardly move. He asked to be carried out on a stretcher so his soldiers could see him. He couldn't talk, but he slowly raised his hand to show that he knew they were there. That one move calmed the anger of thousands. Veterans who had been through a lot cried. Some begged him to get better, while others prayed for him as he passed. They knew what it meant, that he was there without saying anything. Their king was dying, but he hadn't left them. Even though he was in pain, he honored them with his last strength. That moment calmed the soldiers down, but it didn't fix the bigger problem. The soldiers went back to their camps sad instead of angry. But they also came back with the scary news that Alexander, the glue that held there, would not last the week, and their huge empire would fall apart. Without him, the world they had built through blood and fire was about to fall apart. Alexander was hardly awake by the 10th day of his fever. The palace smelled like incense, prayers were whispered, and anxious attendants walked around in a steady rhythm. His generals filled the room, their faces showing fear and exhaustion. They needed one thing more than anything else: a successor. The empire went from Greece to India. Without a clear heir, there was chaos. Not only possible, but also certain. But Alexander didn't have a real adult son. Roxana, his wife, was pregnant, but no one knew if the baby would be a boy. His half-brother Ardus was still alive, but he had trouble thinking clearly and wasn't able to rule on his own. The commanders pushed in, asking for help. Who should get the biggest empire the world has ever seen? Alexander, who was in and out of consciousness, seemed to get it. He had almost lost his voice for days, but when asked who he wanted to take over, he managed to whisper one last thing that sent a chill through the room. To the strongest, some people said they couldn't hear the words because they were so quiet. Some people said he said something else, maybe Tortoaterus, the name of a powerful general who wasn't there. But the version that survived, the one that the men who were closest to him told, was clear. Alexander's empire was based on strength, not family. It was a smart but terrible answer. With that one phrase, he made sure that his generals, who were experienced, ambitious, and very competitive, would fight for control of the empire he had built. Some people later held him responsible for this. Some people said he knew exactly what he was doing. His friends were warriors who had been through many battles. He believed in their strength more than their family ties. But his generals wanted more. They came back to him and asked him how he wanted his funeral to be planned. Alexander thought like a king, even when he was about to die. He said he wanted to be buried in the